So picking up where we left off on the previous deck, we're talking about recruiting. One thing I want to underscore is when we talk about recruiting, we're only talking about generating a pool of qualified job applicants. We're not talking about determining which one is going to be the best fit for our company for this job. We're just talking about generating the biggest pool possible so that when we get to the next stage, which is selection, we have a bigger pool to choose from. So in the previous slide, previous deck, we talked about internal recruiting. External recruiting includes things like advertisements in newspapers, in professional journals, employee referrals, people who just walk in off the street and say, hey, do you have a job? Employment agencies, special events like minority recruitment fairs, internet job sites like monster.com, as well as the organization's own website. So pretty much anything where we're looking outside the organization to try to bring people in. So that takes us to the next stage. Once we have this pool of qualified people, what kind of information do we gather so that we can decide which person or people to offer the job to? And in the process of selection, we use the term test, those of us in HR, to refer to anything that gives us information about the best, who might be best qualified. And when we say who's best qualified, we're really looking at, if you were to draw the correlation between performance on that test, if you think of that as the x-axis, and subsequent job performance on the y-axis, which one has the strongest correlation between the selection test and subsequent job performance. So validation is the process of determining how well a selection test does in terms of predicting future job performance. And that becomes really important in the event that an organization, for example, gets an adverse impact claim. So say the women file a class action suit saying, well, hey, this requirement that we be able to lift 50 pounds of dead weight is screening out all these women, so therefore it's discrimination. And the employer shows, well, actually being able to lift 50 pounds of dead weight is associated with better job performance, like it is in the case of firefighters, police officers, etc. Then even though it does have adverse impact, it is a valid predictor of performance. That's where we get to this notion of validation. And therefore, the courts often do not see it as illegally discriminatory. So some of the tools that organizations use for selecting people are, starting off, application forms and resumes. I want to be clear, the book says application forms may only ask for valid job-related information. That's not to say that they do only ask for valid job-related information, but if they ask for other information, it does open the organization up in terms of, again, adverse impact cases. So if you ask people about their marital status and so on and so forth, that sometimes has adverse impact on women, for example. Resumes are often a problem because about 30% of all resumes have, I'm going to call them major lies. Major meaning, I'm not talking about saying that you made $37,000 a year when you really only made 35. That's a white lie. A major lie is saying that you worked at an organization that you never worked at, or that you have a degree that you never earned, or that you attended a university that you never attended, etc. And about a third of all resumes have these major lies. So if they have major lies, then again, if you're thinking about trying to predict performance from them, you're trying to predict performance from bogus information, so it's not a good predictor. References and background checks are also often used by employers. References refers to the practice of contacting former employers or coworkers to learn more about the candidate. Usually the applicant gets to indicate which contacts the future employer can get a hold of by indicating that when they apply for the job. In the case of background checks, to be clear, by law, the applicant must sign a waiver that allows the employer to perform background checks and financial checks on the employer. They cannot do that on the employee. they cannot do that without the candidate's specific information. And the next slide talks about that a little bit. In addition to the other types of tests that we talked about, there are also sort of more the traditional selection tests or traditional tests, paper and pencil tests, and those can be specific ability tests. So if the job that you're applying for is, say, an engineering job, they may ask you to put together a model of something that might be representative of what you would do in a typical workday. Cognitive abilities tests, these are very controversial because they are among one of the best predictors of subsequent performance, but they also have a fairly high degree of adverse impact against African Americans and minorities, and the courts have gone both ways in cases involving cognitive abilities. Sometimes they've said, well, yes, they do predict performance, so therefore the fact that they have adverse impact does not inherently make them illegal. Other times they've said, well, yes, they do have adverse impact, and therefore you can't legally use these because they screen out too many African Americans and Latinos. So the courts have not been consistent. So it's a very slippery slope. I'm not going to go into the rest of those because they're not used in every single kind of job. The next slide talks about things that you should avoid asking about in an interview. I'm going to leave that to you to go through the list on your own. Interviews are also among one of the most commonly used selection devices. Almost every job requires that you have an interview, and interviews can take a variety of different formats. They can be structured or unstructured, or semi-structured is somewhere in between those two, and they can involve a single interviewer or a panel of interviewers, and it varies from organization to organization. Unstructured interviews do a lousy job predicting performance. And that's really not surprising if you think about it, because an unstructured interview, to give you just an idea, is kind of one of those interviews where you go in, you meet the interviewer, and the interviewer says, hey, did you see the game last night? Yeah, the Huskies did really well, and they start talking about University of Connecticut, and the next thing you know, they're talking about nothing that has anything to do with performance on the job or the employee's ability to perform on the job. So consequently, unstructured interviews do a really poor job predicting performance. Structured interviews, on the other hand, are interviews where there's a list of questions that is created before the interview. It's asked of every single applicant in the same order, the same questions, and usually the structured interview questions are developed from the job analysis, going back to the job analysis again. So if the job analysis indicates that the person is responsible for resolving conflicts among employees, a structured interview question might be, tell us about a situation where you had two employees that were in conflict and how you resolved it or how you addressed it. I'd also alluded to the fact that some interviews have a single interviewer, some have multiple interviewers. Generally speaking, more is better, or it's better to have more. I don't want to mean that 100 is better than 2, but it's better to have a panel than it is to have a single interviewer, because a single interviewer is one human, and every human has biases of one sort or another. They're not always biases relating to a protected characteristic. It could be, I just don't like people who wear a certain type of clothing or something, and that's going to color my impression of that applicant. That's a bias. It's not a protected characteristic, but it's a bias that has nothing to do with performance. So to the extent that you have more people on an interview panel, each individual person's unique quirky biases are going to be washed out by other interviewers. So you end up with structured panel interviews actually being a very strong predictor of performance, whereas unstructured interviews with a single interviewer do a pretty poor job. It talks about different types of structured interviews. I'm not going to go into the details of those. In terms of training, training should start off with a needs assessment. So before you start training your employees, figure out, do they need training? Obviously. It's not really rocket science, but very few organizations actually conduct a needs assessment ahead of time. I'm not going to talk too much about e-training. In the evaluation of training, so after you've sent your employees to training, you want to know, have you invested your money wisely in training these employees? And again, very few organizations do any sort of training assessment. To the extent that they do, this is what's called Bloom's taxonomy: reactions, learning, behavior, results. And it goes in a cumulative way. So reactions are less meaningful than learning, learning is less meaningful than behavior, and behavior is less meaningful than results. So to the extent that they occur at all, it's usually, did you like the training? Was it good? That's kind of like a general effective reaction. Yeah, it was good. It was pretty interesting. Sometimes there'll actually be an assessment of learning that occurred during the training. Sometimes organizations will look for, is the person applying what they learned on the job and actually changing their behavior? And finally, in terms of results, is there actually an ROI on this? Is there a return on investment? Training is not cheap, so organizations who are spending all this money should want to know if they're getting a return on their investment. Performance appraisal has to do with the process of evaluating how well employees are doing their job. And their job is defined by, drum roll please, the job analysis or the job description, right? That tells you what effective job performance is based on the tasks that people perform. And then usually the wise organization creates a performance appraisal instrument that reflects that. And the goal of performance appraisal is really twofold. One is to improve the employee's performance, and two is for administrative decisions: who gets the higher raise, who gets promoted, maybe who gets laid off if the organization is going to end up having a layoff in the near future. And performance appraisal measures vary in the extent to which they're objective versus subjective. There is no true thing as an objective performance measure, because even if you say, okay, well, we're going to use sales, and sales is an objective measure because we can quantify it easily, the fact that we can quantify it doesn't really make it objective, because suppose I'm so focused on selling or obtaining new customers that I don't provide any service to my existing customers, and so they end up dropping off and don't end up repeating purchases, then I'm not really doing such a good job as a salesperson. The more common assessments for most jobs are some type of performance appraisal where an individual or a group of individuals assesses a person's performance relative to the job description. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over some of the next couple of slides. I do want to point out rater training, or in particular frame of reference training, is the most effective means of minimizing bias in performance appraisals. So raters need to be trained on, so if we're evaluating customer service, we need to make sure that all managers who are doing evaluations understand what we mean by customer service, and that all managers understand what it means to get a 1 on customer service versus a 2 versus a 3 versus a 4, etc. That's the best way we know in the HR world to minimize rater bias. Performance appraisal needs not be done by only the supervisor. More common trends in HR include 360-degree feedback, whereby the supervisor and employees at the same level and direct reports, if the person is in a supervisory position, and sometimes customers, all provide information on the person's performance. I'm going to skip over the next few things. Compensation obviously is important, and the focus of compensation needs to be on both making sure that the employee is paid fairly within the organization, as well as paid fairly relative to what he or she could make outside the organization. I'm going to stop there and sort of leave you with the remaining slides on separation and turnover to go over on your own. Have a good week. Take care. Bye.